Good morning, good evening. I hope everything's going well for you. We are jumping into week number 3. We are kind of moving into a little bit of it's always a little micro level, a little bit of macro level, kind of getting to social groups, kind of some larger macro level issues in society itself. The first couple of weeks, right? We kind of provide a little bit of a foundation on some different kind of things. So let's kind of walk through, just kind of retrace some of our steps. Sociology, the systematic study of society. And we're going to be looking at society and trying to understand it. We need to kind of have ideas about institutions, about culture, which was last week, human communities, social groups, organization, networks. We go down the micro level, kind of individual level, all the way into say family, community, social groups, just kind of further and further out until we get to nation, larger globe, and then I guess the universe. Maybe we can go down that pathway. Systematic study of society, trying to understand kind of what's going on in the social world in the past as well as the present. So a lot of different concepts, to kind of anchor into and this sort of sociological perspective, the sociological imagination by C. Wright Mills, the distinguishing between private troubles and public issues is kind of a key idea. That homelessness or being unhoused in today's contemporary society, it's a private trouble in the sense it's individuals who are impacted or who are living that experience. But it's definitely a larger public issue. And the reason for that distinction is sometimes we can get into blaming the individual, looking at it, people just aren't doing enough to help themselves and all these different kind of things. Very individualized account for what's going on versus having this imagination and thinking about larger kind of social forces that are going on, never to remove somebody's agency or, like what are they doing in terms of that are maybe shaping and influencing their life position, but moving away from an individual level analysis and looking at things at a much more macro level. Also things like the beginner's mind, like the idea that an expert mind is a mind that nothing can be learned. And going back to culture, that we're immersed in culture, everything's like normal to us. We don't see that we're swimming in the water. So it's trying to approach things with a fresh mind, trying to suspend our judgment. We start talking about things like social class in the United States or ideas of, looking at poverty, causes of poverty, and how to sort of think through these particular social issues. Sometimes we have to kind of suspend our own kind of cultural way of thinking and knowing, because for us to be able to more systematically understand something or to approach things kind of with fresh eyes. And then we can kind of get all kinds of things like the general and the particular, right? Looking for patterns with the strange and the familiar, find the unique in the everyday life, the oddities about everyday life, the stuff that we're surrounded by, and just kind of ask questions about. We have our 3 main theories: functionalism, conflict theory, and interactionism. Functionalism and conflict theory, both macro level. Functionalism, that idea of the ecosystem model. Society is all these different institutions with different functions, all interrelated parts. Conflict theory is our model of looking at examining social inequality in order to create a more equitable society. So it's addressing class, race, gender, other inequities. It's a model of social justice. And then the interactionist perspective, looking at language and meaning, self-concept, identity, these kind of things. Last week we were into culture. This week, we were looking at the intersection of macro level and the micro level. And ultimately, sociology is kind of trying to work in both directions. Some sociologists are kind of micro level researchers. It's their area of focus, but they would be grounded in and knowing that the more macro level. But people specialize in one or the other, but oftentimes there's sort of these mid-level kind of theories or crossover. So let's kind of start off this section on looking at groups, life in groups, micro level, macro level, different types of status. The scribe status is the status that it's ascribed to us. It's given to us at birth. It's involuntary. It's just assigned to us by culture. So gender is an ascribed status. Race is an ascribed status. Your ability status is an ascribed status if a person's born with a physical or other disability. So So ascription can be really powerful, right? If you go back to the idea of thinking like the Thomas theorem, if we define it, it's real and it's real in its consequences. We're thinking about the interactionist perspective. That status is a system of ranking or assigning meaning and assigning order. And so if we're looking at an ascribed status, we're having some group and some members of society are ascribed different kinds of status. It's involuntary, it's just given to them at birth, right? So we have sometimes is there a privilege with certain kinds of ascriptions? What are the consequences for certain ascriptions in certain environments? So sometimes race makes a difference in certain environments, or gender. So it's kind of being aware, again, like going back to this idea of like the social environment and context, and idea of like sociological imagination. As we imagine our journey is only an individual journey, it's whatever life you make, life is what you make of it. It's like, well, yeah, it's partly true, but also things like ascribed statuses make a difference. I have this female police officer. I'm not sure why it'd be interesting to look at the demographics of contemporary law enforcement here in Central Oregon, the composition of male, female in terms of law enforcement officers definitely changed over the years, definitely getting closer. Imagine moving closer and closer to, to 50%, but still more male dominated profession. And I guess, there's the question of, a female officer entering there, there's this gender ascription going on, the assumptions that are made about potentially a female officer, and not only from other officers, let's say, but society at large, the person themselves. Anyway, these are kind of all the issues to think about with ascription. And then there's achieved status, a status that we achieve through our own efforts, that we end up, obtaining a different status, educational level, occupation, all those are achieved statuses. Then there's embodied statuses, characteristics of who we are, not having hair, being tall, being short, physical features, physical self, embodied status. Even things like the clothes that we wear, and communicate status, but also shapes potentially interactions as well. And then master status is a status that has exceptional social significance, one that stands out among other statuses, and it's can have importance for one's own identity, but also how other people see that individual. To see the female law enforcement officer, to say it's not only a law enforcement officer, it's a female law enforcement officer, a law enforcement officer of color, like these become the master status of what gets kind of identified or isolated. This is the bottom left. Bottom left there is a female rock climber. She doesn't have her full arm. She saw a documentary of hers a couple of years ago, pretty amazing. Why I bring it up here is in her documentary, she talks about she's at the climbing gym, and people, it's just say like, hey, you're an amazing climber for having one arm. And she's like, I'm just an amazing climber anyway, right? So it's this focus on this, to me, is like, well, that's a great example of a master status, is individuals see her as being sort of the one-arm climber. But she's like, man, I'm just an amazing climber. To see me beyond that, right? To see the full me in a way. So you can look at this kind of like looking at status in that way. And here's a couple different examples I think are really interesting. The meaning that we assign to people who are tall, just the height. There's been a lot of research in this area that we give more authority to people who are tall. And that's just sort of like something that's built in society itself. The clothes that we wear, it's kind of like this embodied kind of thing. The women wearing pants. That was like, in Congress, like this shift to go from women wearing dresses. I'm telling you, it was controversial back in the 1970s and 80s when women started wearing pants. It's like, well, what's going on, right? They are, through a person's dress, communicating something, in this case, changing culture. I think sometimes status, you could look at the importance of looking at status as well, in terms of, like in this case, looking at schools. Who are the teachers? Who are the students? What are the racial demographics, class demographics of the teachers, of the students, of the administrators? In certain areas, there's been a lot of focus in Oregon of trying to create greater equity in schools, equity specifically in regarding to staffing, and looking at the racial demographics of students compared to teachers and administrators, and to make them more, to facilitate the demographics of administrators and teachers being more closely aligned with the demographics of students. So imagine the power of that, right? So that walking around in the world and seeing yourself represented in places of authority, what that might do to a person's sense of self, their understanding about others as well. And it becomes really important. So representation becomes kind of a key thing, and being aware of that status. Kind of interesting too, that individuals who have a distinct status, so for example, a person of color has a different understanding about their racial identity, most likely than someone who's a member of the dominant culture. So a member of the dominant culture, oftentimes that status is less visible. It's not a master status, right? So if you have a master status that's ascribed to you, it's a distinct part of your identity that's going to stick out. You're going to be aware of that much more consciously overall than individuals who are a member of the dominant group. We can also look at subcultures and countercultures and kind of go here too and think about status. So subcultures are cultures that exist within society. So like they're sub, right? You got the big umbrella, and we've got this other like little pocket community, a subculture. That has usually its own language, style, its own history, lifestyle, things that they do, usually activity-based or, music. Subcultures are rich. And so it's a group, whether loosely organized or very specific to a particular location or demographic, that there's less visible to the dominant culture in society. So subcultures could be very permeable. Looking at like the climbing subculture, it's like a big subculture, right? But there may be a niche even within a particular area of a climbing subculture. It's a way for people to find meaning and connection within that. A counterculture is what cultures that are formed that are in opposition to dominant culture in society and trying ultimately to change it. I think it's kind of interesting to me, you can apply status to these different areas, even within a subculture. Kind of interesting, like, if we have like society, all these people being, like millions of people in society, we're not even thinking about subcultures. We have status arrangements going on. Boom, let's go into a subculture. Well, some of the same things are going to be going on. There's going to be these sort of status markers that are happening, van subculture, markers around status that are there. Techno subculture, music subculture, doesn't really matter. It's like these ideas of status are going to be present in whatever community that we are operating in. I find it kind of interesting looking at prison subculture is a great example of this as well. Very distinct, vocabulary, language, attitude, disposition, ways of behaving, thinking, doing, all these different kind of things that there's been a lot of research or recognition of a distinct subculture within kind of the prison environment. So what it tells us, I think, in some ways, is that subcultures arrive based on maybe a necessity or based on kind of the needs of the situation. People are looking for meaning and connection. They're differentiating themselves from dominant culture. In some case, in this case, like with the prison, they're like, it's by choice in one way for sure, but they're in this environment where it's almost like the environment is shaping sort of that creation of that subculture. All right, so theme number one, just kind of walking through, just define the terminology. And then the second part here is like with Central Oregon, an occupation. I'm thinking about, for example, looking at occupation and how does status apply? If a person works in the construction industry, like where do you see status within the construction industry? Maybe personal experiences with individuals, of working within an industry and interacting with individuals of different race, different gender, different class. Like, how do you see status in Central Oregon? Distinguishing between subculture, countercultures in this part is to identify a subculture, look it up, check it out, and yeah, like what is it? Find something that interests you and just provide a little bit of information about that subculture and what makes it distinct. And then finally, like, what is the benefit of studying status? Like, why do it? What does it tell us about society or social organization? All right, theme number 2. This is kind of like moving in a totally different direction. And theme number 2 is examining kind of this a major shift that happened in society, Western societies as well as others. We could apply this model to any society that's going through a transition from an agrarian way of life to an industrial way of life. So in the United States, starting in you could say by late 1700s, 1800s, the industrial era, industrialization, that we're moving away from an agricultural-based society to an industrial-based society. And this is the work of Ferdinand Tönnies, and Durkheim also had theorizing or perspectives on this sort of major rupture and shift going on in society. And I think we're going through another one now, facilitated by new advanced technologies, is that there's another kind of major shift going on in society. So this is kind of like, I'm not gonna go through all these different ideas, but the Gemeinschaft, that communities were built upon trust, loyalty, honor, is more collectivistic in terms of spirit and idea. Then you get, it's like this, what we call a mechanical division of labor, where people are connected to their employment, their job. They don't have like going to work and having an employer. It's a time period, it's more simply organized society and community. And then you get into a community that's based on Gesellschaft, the industrial capitalist model, focus on skills and abilities and competence, rational, legal kind of framework in society itself. Things become much more sophisticated, complicated, much more focused on individualism becomes more important. And the reason to kind of bring this up is to kind of illustrate that the way that we operate, that humans experience the world, is being shaped by these larger social forces, right? So that if we look back in an agrarian community and society, it was organized, fundamentally organized in a different way, which impacted, the human experience. I think the more we understand that organization, we can more take that comparison between the past and the present and be able to better understand how humans might be experiencing the world or challenges that are going along with that. All right, so Durkheim's anomie is a normlessness due to sudden change. So imagine this rupture in society. You want to call it a rupture. I mean, it happened over decades, happened over a long period of time, but a major transition where, let's say, family and community were the center of everyday life. People weren't going to the workforce, but it was, they were working on in an agricultural or a trade, like being a blacksmith or whatever it may have been. Of course, we're kind of like, I'm highlighting here certain occupations where, anyway, I don't want to go down that pathway. But think about family and community and connection between those. What happens when we transition to industrial capitalism? People are moving to the cities, urbanization is going on. It's like all this massive change happening. And it's for Durkheim, this idea of anomie, it's like too much change too fast, and it creates a lot of challenges for social organization. One of the questions about kind of modernity or this transition to sort of modern day life is, how do you unify people in society, create that sort of sense of that we're in this together at a time period when there's incredible population growth, expansion of diversity, pockets of community. So it creates a challenge in terms of creating stability within society itself. We can look at things like virtual or mediated communities, the ways in which they may operate to create some meaning, but are there some challenges with that? There's a lot of work. Your textbook talks about, or the author's textbook talk about Putnam's work on Bowling Alone, which is, I didn't think it was the greatest read, but the analysis is really a powerful analysis. And that's the basic argument perspective Putnam's offering is that until like starting in the 1970s, well, let's just go 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and through the 1970s, people were, individuals were involved in civic organizations, like their local chapters of the Lions Club or Rotary Club or other organizations. City council was made up of members from a lot of different social classes. And then things like activities, leisure, bowling, going out, having a bowling league was a cross section of a lot of people, and people participated in the community. And what Putnam is kind of getting at is starting in the 1970s, 1980s, we get this sort of retreatment from that community space. People are living more and more individualized and isolated, socialized, and we don't have that connectivity to social organizations and community organizations the same way as before. This is an image of labor unions, be a good example of this as well. Like back until, I mean, the United States and labor unions has always been a little bit of a rocky history there for sure. And we think we could use our conflict theory to kind of think about that a little bit. But labor used to be a place of a lot of meaning for a lot of people. That was a way of connecting, of generating a sense of belonging and connection. And there's been a retreat from unions over the years until maybe recently, a recent formation of a union in New York for among Amazon employees. John Deere factory employees recently unionized. So there's kind of a move toward trying to create some unionization. And part of that may be not only individuals looking for a voice in their employment, but also seeking a sense of membership into community. I put these images of MSNBC and Fox News to kind of indicate that, that we live in this is like another rupture that we're going through in society itself. We have so many different informational channels that can divide us, that, they become news channels that represent a particular political viewpoint and perspective. And then we kind of lose in the process, a kind of a more unifying, uniting kind of source of information, right? So division versus kind of moving towards a shared community. I'll go real quick through this, but just kind of like demonstrate this, like, a shift in a movement. This is 1700s, looking at within Pennsylvania. Probably most of the colonies were operated in this way. People were punished in the street, or punished in these kind of methods. There was no institution for incarceration at that point in time. The Walnut Street prison was the first prison out there in Pennsylvania, first kind of prison. But it wasn't really this big institution. And then later on, as become more modernized, new technologies, architecture starts to change. The first penitentiary is built, and outside of Philadelphia. And it becomes like boom, man. It's like we're building institutions to address these like larger social issues, problems. It's a major transition going on in society. Now we have instruments of social control that we didn't have before. And of course, some questions are going to come up about that. This is some images from Eastern State Penitentiary. This idea of solitary confinement was being used for a period of time until people realized sort of the fault of that or the consequences of that particular model. And then I probably could include here, like looking at contemporary prisons. You can look at the architecture as a cool thing to look at. This is like culture. But you could look at changes going on in society by looking at the architecture of time periods, and you can see changes. I mean, within, like things are cruising along, certain kind of architecture, and then boom, something changes, right? And that change that's going on within architecture is probably going on throughout society itself. New technologies, new materials, new ideologies, perspectives, things that are going on, population size and centers. I mean, so many things that are happening that are shaping that. A couple of examples of the Gesellschaft, or this sort of transition, and thinking about work. Here's someone I was trying to get some images of individuals like, who are craftspeople, a shoemaker, right? Somebody who, this is, think about the way you're connected to your labor in a different way. If you are the shoemaker, you're connected to your customers in a different way. You wouldn't even see them as, I don't know, the language of customers is kind of a contemporary language. You're in the marketplace, you're buying and selling goods, or you're creating and selling goods. But then you get a factory system, right? Now that, somebody's doing something in a repetitive process. And then these sort of mass factories where people are doing work, and it's sort of this world of mass consumption. The new jobs that we have maybe are service, some of them are in these service-oriented jobs and occupations where we're far removed from the labor, but now we're maybe on the selling side, or the labor's moved somewhere else, and we are on a different side of that. David Graeber's work on bullshit jobs, I think, is really kind of interesting about sort of the the shift in occupations going back to this, right? So it's not only a major transformation in society, but also the kind of the work we do and how we are organized. And then this kind of leads to like, I don't know, really interesting kind of examination. Johan Hari, he's a journalist, just running this sort of examination of thinking about contemporary social world and the challenges that we face and its impact on our mental health. Sebastian Younger kind of writing in a similar space, a little bit different though, about the need for human belonging and connection. And that's what we seek. I think post-COVID and post-COVID has been real interesting too, of like, you know, we are social creatures and seeking a sense of connection and connectivity with others. All right, so this one is this theme, like looking at the technological revolution, incredibly powerful. So go to this website. Here's an image you'll see when if you type this in, Pew Research, future people's well-being, you'll get it'll look something like that. Look over, you don't have to read it all, but just look over some of the ideas. I think there's really interesting comments that are being made by different researchers about impact of technology. So look it over. And then differentiate between Gesellschaft, Gesellschaft, define anomie, explain it, and then provide a general discussion of the impact of technology and well-being on our lives. Of technology on our well-being, I think is what that should say, on our well-being, and then bring in ideas from the Pew Research study to kind of add to or support your ideas. All right, the next 2 points are a little bit shorter. McDonaldization is George Ritzer's idea that he draws from Max Weber, an earlier sociologist, and Weber was interested in a lot of different things, but one area he is probably most well known for is understanding rationalization, bureaucracies, the development of bureaucracies. What he viewed, but Weber viewed through like kind of like a plus and minus, that with more rationally organized society, things are more efficient, more things get done. So it allows us to serve the needs of the larger population. Sometimes we get what he calls like this iron cage of rationality. We get kind of caught in this trap of rationality, and they become very dehumanizing. I just needed to call an organization, a business the other day about like an insurance company or something. Then get into their phone tree, number one, you know, like push this number, this number, this number. And then you finally get to an agent. And, you know, agents are going through their job. This is like a bullshit job thing that, you know, going through a script, like that's their job. That's what they do, you know, and the person that you could tell they're just full on like this mechanical mode of going through their script. And man, it's just, you know, for Weber, it's like, it may be rational and efficient, but there could be some consequences to that too. So Ritzer takes that idea and basically looks at this idea that McDonaldization, what he calls it, that the world's becoming more and more rational. The ideas and principles that worked in the fast food industry of McDonald's, of creating a product that can be efficiently delivered. So how do you do it more efficiently, quicker? Number two, calculability. So bigger is better, or quantity over quality. More predictable or uniform. So regardless of where you go, you get the same product. Go to Starbucks here versus somewhere else, it's predictable, right? Control, I think I should say probably control through automation. So automation of more and more of the industry, or more and more of the work, kind of removes the, I don't know, human error or the need for human labor. So it's control through automation. And then kind of one dimension that Ritzer will bring up too is in some ways there's irrationality to it. Its impact on humans, or, you know, it's about facilitating increased consumption, but there are environmental and other social issues with that. He also takes this idea a little bit further and goes with Starbuckization, this concept of McDonaldization, but now it's also applied to that Starbucks creates an image. This is the Starbucks part of it. It's like dramaturgical, that Starbucks presents themselves as the third home, not work, not home, but your third home, a place to kind of rest. But it's an illusion, it's an image. And so that businesses and enterprises are fabricating a model or creating a model of what they appear to be, kind of thing. So here's some different examples. Yeah, just like, you know, going through a checkout, self-checkout, right? This is one I just love. This one, pancake sausages on a stick. Man, your complete breakfast on a stick. What an amazing thing. Efficient. It's predictable. It's going to be a mass production of these, quantity versus quality. Maybe it's fairly cheap. You don't see these anymore. I mean, streaming services, right? Kind of replacing a lot of things. Your histories, your search histories. I mean, everything driven by algorithms. I mean, you can go like on and on. Even I think it's about our straight white teeth, our design of our places of commerce or shopping malls, strip malls, our housing developments, McMansions, McHousing, McUniversity, McReligion. There's all these sort of connections that people have made. Here's my uncle Bob and my cousin Amy. They are national champion corn huskers. They go to competition every year and they husk corn, take it off the stalk and throw it into the bin back here. In fact, there's one going through the air right there. And so my dad was young, and I was chatting with my Uncle Bob about this, that they would walk down rows of corn. This is how they harvested corn. Walk down rows of corn, and my grandfather would be on one side, and my dad, his two brothers, on the other side of the row, and they would just go down rows of corn and husking corn. So imagine going from that. My dad was born in 1939, so that'd have been 1940s, 70 some years ago. And this is like today. Like, this is my uncle on my mom's side of the family. This is probably from 2019. I was back there during harvest season, and I mean, it's like GPS technology. I mean, it's crazy the amount of yield and production that's going on. It's been a huge, the agricultural revolution, but then there's some consequences, the irrationality, monoculture. So we have less diversification of crops, more pesticides and fertilizers. What's the impact on pollinating the pollinators, bees, butterflies, other pollinators? I mean, there's really ecological issues that are associated with that. What's the consequence in terms of like big ag? We're facilitating, the development of big agriculture, and there's a big carbon footprint with that. It's also a lot of power within an industry versus dispersing that throughout communities themselves. I don't know, just another example. This was just kind of a weird one. I don't know, just interesting. I ran across this. This is, you get on if you're ever in a city, get on a tram, and you have the same voice. So they're like doing this kind of work, and you can read this if you want, but they're doing this kind of work of trying to create an algorithm, gather a lot of data and information, marketing strategy, change that voice, change the message based on a lot of different factors, like using this incredibly sophisticated technology to change the message. I'm like, it's just a message, right? But it's this way of like, I don't know, it's just an amazing way technology gets involved in sort of social life. So the third part here is just basically identify, explain the benefits of McDonaldization, the limitations of it, provide 4 different examples of McDonaldization. Where do you see it? Where do you see it in sort of the social world? And then finally, kind of getting down here, is looking at some research on conformity. So kind of go through the research, and then we'll kind of get into the critique of that research. So to say this research, that goes, some of the research, these studies like Milgram studies and Barta study, provides this idea that humans have this propensity, or in an environment that underneath who we are is this sort of violent, selfish side of who we are kind of thing. This is a story that's being told. If you ever read Lord of the Flies, sometimes it's kind of a sign as a reading during high school, and these kids get dropped off or stranded on an island, and then they basically become these resorts, they become animals, develop a hierarchy, they're harming each other, all this kind of stuff, right? This is the story that we tell. In this book, Humankind, A Hopeful History, there's a really fascinating story or examination of all this research, but then looking at more broadly, how do we understand human behavior? What is the story we tell about human behavior? I encourage you, if you're interested in this, it's a really engaging read. Anyway, so the story we tell is that humans are these potentially bad, ruthless, cruel creatures. The reality is this is like the real story, the real Lord of the Flies, kind of an event that did happen. These kids were going to school one day. They were, I believe, from New Zealand, and they decided to play hooky, skipped school, jumped on a boat, started cruising around. Storm came up. They got lost at sea, ended up stranded on an island. They're there for 15 months, a year and a half. They had to survive. They cooperated. They worked together. They eventually get rescued by a ship, and they were a unit. Like they pulled together. Like that's the story. Is this like a fiction and then reality kind of thing? So which story do we want to tell? Well, Zimbardo in the Stanford prison experiment, creates this mock prison at Stanford University. Students sign up, college students sign up to be part of the experiment. He creates a mock prison. The individuals sign up for the study. They either get assigned to be a prisoner or a guard. If they're a prisoner, they get picked up from their place of residence, get brought into a mock police station, get charged, and get processed, and then get taken to this mock jail. Well, what happens in the experiment, the story goes, is that individuals, the guards, start to dehumanize the prisoners. After so many days, Zimbardo calls it off because people are having this sort of like, there's a lot of mental anguish going on and problems that are happening. Well, there's been a lot of critique of Zimbardo's work, that the claims that he was making are not quite founded based on the evidence that actually the evidence from that particular experiment. And there's a lot of criticisms, like, the biases of, what Zimbardo was looking for, how he reported his information, how he was encouraging the inmates or the guards to behave in particular ways. I mean, one thing to kind of maybe as a comparison to think about, if you took 30 people, put them into an environment and said, okay, half of you are going to be guards, half of you are going to become prisoners. And there's no like this trying to influence and trying to shape, like Zimbardo is trying to, like he was encouraging certain kinds of behavior, but if left people on their own, what would people do? I think that would be a different kind of question to ask. And then there's been a lot of like, especially with replication studies, they call them, like, they're trying to reproduce Stanford's, a lot of this work, this prison experiment, as well as others that, they can't, there's not, it just indicates in trying to replicate these studies, they run into like the findings, like we try to do it again, but we find maybe some consistency, but a lot of inconsistency is what was originally reported. So it doesn't have a lot, it loses some of its validity. I think one of the classic ones for the Stanford prison experiment is one of the individuals that was one of the inmates is like crying to get out, screaming, like he can't handle it anymore. And later on, he says, well, I was faking it. And I think he had an exam to prepare for graduate school. So he was screaming in order to get out. He knew it's like, this is what Zimbardo wanted. So I gave him what he wanted. I screamed, this is how I got out. This is how I got out. And Zimbardo was kind of reporting that as like, look what's happening to people in that environment. It's like, okay, there's a lot of other things that are happening that to unpack with Zimbardo's experiment. But you wouldn't want to like get rid of like, I don't know, there's still value in components of that study. One of the connections, Abu Ghraib prison during the time period of escalated military involvement, American military involvement in the Middle East, that there's this event that happened over a period of time, the way that military personnel were treating the prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison. And it became this sort of connection to the Stanford prison experiment. And what Zimbardo's analysis was, it's the bad barrel, not the bad apple. So we have to move away from the officer level and think about an institution structure kind of thing. So I think there's still value in that space, but to be a little bit more critical of the story that, this is what humans will become if they get in that environment. I think humans can be, they can be encouraged to become. There's a lot of things that happen within an environment that either encourage or discourage certain kinds of behavior. The same would be said for Milgram and Milgram study, where people are subjects. There's a teacher and a learner. The student is actually working with the researcher, like they know what's going on. They're called a confederate, so that if you're a part of if this particular person here would be knowledgeable about everything that's going on in the study. So they're not the subject. The subject is the teacher. So somebody comes in, participates in this research study, they become assigned the role of the teacher. They think that it's a random assignment, that there's two people come into a room. Okay, one of you is going to be the teacher, one's the student. Well, the person who's the confederate always going to be the student. They're the one who's going to be getting shocked if they give a wrong answer. Questions come up on a screen. Teacher is told that if they give the student gives the wrong answer, then the experimenter, then they need to give a shock, a voltage to that individual gave the wrong answer. And they're given a reason for it. It's like trying to understand, they're trying to test, the impact of kind of a negative response to learning, something like this. And what Milgram kind of reports is that people are willing to go all the way up to 450 volts in some cases, basically lethal voltage, because they're following instructions, like this obedience to authority that humans are inclined to. And again, like with Zimbardo's study, is that there's problems with the evidence itself, what they're reporting. There's inconsistencies, inadequacies of Milgram study. And some of the conclusions that he draws may not be as deterministic as he's letting on, so that humans can be obedient to authority, but it's not, there's a lot in these experiments that that subjects were responding in different ways, resisting the following order. They were doing different things, but it's that humans have to really be encouraged to do certain things, and it happens in a social environment around peers and other people. There's a lot more factors going on than just sort of this authority figure and the teacher themselves. So it's much more nuanced, complicated, and not as deterministic, this idea that we have this internal tendency to be obedient to authority. But as with Zimbardo, I don't think you want to throw all these studies out and say there's no value in them. I think it's like, how do you work with them and understand them? And then how can we help to understand human behavior, maybe in a more complex way? This is an image of Museum of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. I was there years ago. And this is where Rocky Balboa in the Rocky movies, where in the Rocky 1 ran up the steps, and probably Rocky 2, Rocky 3. There's a statue there. This is really interesting to me. There's a statue there, and it's a public statue, and people were lining up to get their picture taken. And there was a person standing here who was collecting money to get your picture taken next to the statue. And I was like, wow, man, it's like a lot of conformity going on. It's like, this is a public statue. You don't have to stand in line. Neither do you have to stand in line, and neither do you have to pay to get your picture taken with it. Somebody who's an entrepreneur making a few bucks. And then Ash's study of conformity. Ash's idea that humans are social creatures. We tend to conform. That's a pro-social thing. We all have degrees of conformity. Sometimes over-conformity can be a problem, but absolutely. But conformity is part of of who we are as humans. I mean, we can't move away from that. And his study of conformity was these lines, had a bunch of people sitting around in a circle. One person is the subject, the rest of the people are confederates. They know what's going on. People go along, they go, okay, which line matches up? Does this line matches up with which line over here? And sometimes they'll be going around and people start saying, well, it's A, or it's B. And eventually some subjects start to agree with the dominant will of the group itself. So kind of saying, okay, people have a tendency to conform. This is a picture of bark mulch. This is, I was going out to my mom's for a period when I was one spring, and I noticed that neighbors in her cul-de-sac, one neighbor got bark mulch, and then went back a couple weeks later, and then like another neighbor, and then it was like all of a sudden, like everybody's getting bark mulch, and it was one neighbor got a different color of bark mulch, and and there was a sort of discussion that was the wrong bark mulch, and neighbors weren't happy that was a different bark mulch. I'm like, wow, it's really interesting. It's like a great example of conformity throughout a lifespan, right? It's part of who we are. This is kind of interesting. I was talking with a friend of mine who lives down in Southern California, and he said, this person, a neighbor had a flag flying from their house, be a lion, not a sheep, kind of this political statement kind of thing. And I was like, well, it's really interesting that lions live in prides. They live in a social group. All animals, all humans are animals. All animals live in a social group. Every group, there's conformity going on. And ideas that were outside of that, I think, are misunderstanding human experience and condition, number one. And this sort of represents to me too this idea of maybe a cultural notion of this rugged individualism. I am my own person kind of thing. Like, we fiercely defend that space. But if I kind of go back, but we're all seeking community, belonging, and connection. This is like a subcultural kind of thing to form a sense of community meaning, maybe in a time period of rupture and massive change. I mean, that we can start to bring some of these pieces together. A couple different reads. This is a really fascinating read on sociology of disasters, A Paradise Built in Hell. And what her examination is that, kind of in a nutshell, is disasters provide a unique opportunity to study human communities and society and human behavior. Because if you have let's say the Twin Towers, 9/11, you can look at organization before disaster happens. How does the community come together, organize? And what the general trajectory is that humans come together for mutual aid and mutual support. They build their own infrastructure and systems of community and support. And it's this real powerful testament to humans' ability to organize, to cooperate for their own survival and for the betterment of community and society. And then this is kind of, I don't know, an interesting book, Eli Saslow's book. He was born into a family of white nationalists, and he became part of that as well until he went off to college, university. I can't remember where it was, somewhere in the South. That was a liberal arts college, and got introduced to a lot of different ideas, perspectives, and kind of writes his account of coming out of that. And I think it's really just kind of a power testament to, like, he's involved in this sort of subculture, a group. And you're in that culture, in that space, going back to beginner's mind. Like, he at some point, by being in a different culture for a while, started to ask questions for that before he wasn't asking questions about. It was just like normal kind of life stuff. And it was through that experience that he started to evaluate and think about the social world in his life in a different way. All right, the last theme. So these three studies, Zimbardo, Milgram, Ash, briefly describe them. What were they saying about human behavior? Watch this video. You can put the untold truth of the Stanford prison experiment. It'll look like this. Based on the lecture information in the video, what were the claims Zimbardo made? What are a few limitations of the study? A more difficult question is, before the conclusion of these studies were critiqued in recent years, they were largely supported by not only researchers, but by the general public. I think people are fascinated by these stories, and they supported this story that this is like humans are these kind of creatures that do these horrible things. What might be a problem with these broad claims about how and why humans do evil things and do to others? So it's kind of this large, more general question, but one to kind of explore why storytelling, construction of reality a little bit, why storytelling about who humans are is important to investigate and understand. All right, have a great day. See you in class. Keep me posted if you have any questions. Take care.